everybody. Welcome to the Equity.Guru Gauntlet video series, where we ask public company CEOs the tough questions that make the IR guys retire early. With me today, I've got Ben Lightburn, who's from Filament Health. How would you describe Filament in 25 words or less there?
I would describe Filament by saying we are a leading, naturally focused psychedelic drug discovery and development company.
Do you think that people assume that anything that has psychedelics included in the company description is automatically pie in the sky, maybe even scammy?
Do I think that people assume that, or do I think that that is the actual case?
No. Do you suffer from that stigma?
I don't think so. I think most legitimate psychedelics companies are focused on regulated activities. We make a very clear example in our own company that we have all the necessary licenses and permits, and we work with Health Canada very closely. We work with the FDA very closely. I think maybe like 5 or 10 years ago, if that would have been the case, but now there's a real focus on drug development and highly regulated activities. So I think it's a little bit it's a little bit less cowboy, but because of that, I think you are seeing there's perhaps going to be a changing of the guard, I think management teams and business plans that maybe don't fit more with the more regulated world that's arrived, and you may see some failures in the industry.
I think if I think about other pharmaceuticals that have an origin that's maybe not the same as their destination, like let's say vitamin D comes from lanolin, which comes from sheep's wool. People don't dismiss vitamin companies as being sheep grease companies, right? You're essentially building a biotech company that just happens to be dealing with psychedelics. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're, filling out the drum circle on Third Beach.
Although I'm sure many people do both, and the drum circle can be fun too. But you're totally right. These are, for the moment, these are pharmaceutical products only, and they should be judged on whether they can provide alleviation for suffering. Whether or not they come from magic mushrooms, or they're a psychedelic, or they're a controlled substance, that's all history, right? That's all water under the bridge. And we can obviously, complain all we want that, Nixon made them illegal back in the 70s for his culture war. But again, it doesn't really do us any good, because the goal is to get them approved as medications so that they can help people.
Right. So in terms of the psychedelic landscape, there are companies that are looking to build synthetic solutions. There are companies that focus on the natural. Is there a middle ground between those two?
I think so, and I think it's us, frankly. The advantage, and I want to say one thing, is that we're definitely not anti-synthetic. Even though we may be very much pro-natural, we think there are many advantages with the natural side. But that doesn't mean that synthetics are bad. In fact, synthetics are good because they allow for some of the earlier clinical research that we have, and obviously the leading psychedelic drug candidates are synthetic in nature. The advantages of synthetics are that they are highly repeatable. They're highly precise in their manufacturing. Relatively simple to manufacture in the case of psychedelics. So they do. Synthetic manufacturing provides many attractive benefits for drug development. However, on the natural side, there are other advantages. There are actually more compounds in, say, magic mushrooms than just psilocybin. And when you make a synthetic psilocybin, you're not making these other secondary compounds, which we actually hope to prove over time provide different kinds of benefits with respect to just the isolated single molecule. Nature, however, is variable, right? No two mushrooms are exactly alike. And therefore, for mushrooms or for any raw psychedelic plant species, to be a viable therapeutic tool, we need to employ various technologies in order to standardize the active dose of the substances given. And that's why I said we feel like we live kind of in the middle ground between synthetic and natural. We are taking natural substances and we're fervent natural believers, but we're applying just a little bit of extra technology to make it so that these natural psychoactive psychedelic raw materials can be transformed into a pharmaceutical grade and entered into clinical trials for research.
In the cannabis boom back in the day, every single company was focused on patients, medical, because that was where regulatory issues were moving. As soon as recreational opened up, you barely heard anything about medical side of things. Do you see that similar landscape unfolding for psychedelics?
I think it will likely be the other way around. I think that we will probably see legal, regulated pharmaceutical psychedelics before we see recreational psychedelics. Mm-hmm. And that's probably because it's actually been pharmaceutical research that has sort of kept the psychedelics industry, at least the sort of reputable above ground psychedelics industry, alive over the decades. And I think it's fair to say that recreational cannabis use is illegal or legal is much more common than recreational psychedelics use, although that is also changing. So it's kind of like the reverse. Whereas in cannabis, I think you kind of had the recreational leading the charge, but then also people were touting the medical benefits. In psychedelics, we really have the medical benefits leading the charge, and then the recreational access will kind of follow in the slipstream. Got it.
So a lot of companies in that space, not to compare cannabis and psychedelics too closely, but I think there are definitely some parallels. There was a lot of talk early on about clinical trials, about educating doctors, about getting the product to a place where it didn't have the stigma anymore. But not a lot of those trials actually took place. What are you seeing that's different in psychedelics and specifically your company?
Frankly speaking, we're seeing lots of clinical trials. There was a seminar with Health Canada earlier today, and I think they said that they had now approved 9 psilocybin clinical trials and 8 MDMA clinical trials. And fascinatingly, 5 of the psilocybin clinical trials had actually been approved this year within 2022. So in the last 3 months or so. If you go on clinicaltrials.gov and you type in psilocybin, you see, I think, 80 or 90 clinical trials at any given time. I think that's because clinical trials really are the best way now to distribute and administer psilocybin and other controlled psychedelics. The kind of legal framework that already exists is designed to actually give people access to these kinds of controlled substances. As it pertains to us particularly with clinical trials, we actually have 2 aspects of our business. We run clinical trials on our own candidates, but we also partner with third-party drug developing companies who license our ingredients in order to do their own clinical trials. So if you do go on the Health Canada clinical trials database, the ones that are published, all of the phase 2 or later trials, in fact, half of them are using our drug candidate in order to progress. Our in-house trials are being run in the United States at the University of California, San Francisco, where we, in the last few months, received the FDA's authorization to conduct the very first clinical trial using naturally sourced psychedelic substances, as well as being the first trial to directly administer psilocin, which is actually the active form of psilocybin. It's not commonly known. Psilocybin must convert into another compound in the body before it becomes bioactive. And since that other compound is unstable, it's called psilocin, since it's unstable when manufactured synthetically, so far all research has actually been done with synthetic psilocybin until now.
Okay, so I mean that kind of points me into an area of your company I think is really interesting and possibly underappreciated by the general retail, and that is your patent strategy. It's one thing to be able to, at some distant point, be in a more progressive legislative landscape where you're allowed to sell mushrooms or the derivatives, but to actually own IP that other companies are dependent on, that seems to me to be a whole new ballgame.
I agree, and I think it's a very attractive part of the filament story. Most companies in the industry are very proud to announce that they've applied for a provisional patent application. We're now fortunate to actually have 2 issued Canadian patents, and we're expecting several more patents in the coming months, and many more in the coming years. And it's that base of patented technology which goes into manufacturing our drugs, which I think makes our candidates so attractive from a licensing perspective for third parties. One of the challenges in drug development in psychedelics up till now has been lack of IP protection, right? Companies need some kind of protection if they're going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars developing a drug. And without any protection, it doesn't make any sense. And since psychedelic compounds are all found in nature, it's not possible to patent them. But what we've done is we've patented technologies necessary for their natural manufacturing, purification, standardization, and stabilization. When you make things naturally, there's actually only a limited number of ways to do things efficiently and feasibly. And until now, no one had actually discovered what ways were useful for making these naturally derived psychedelic drug candidates. So that's really where the foundation of our IP rests.
Got it. So your trials, as they progress and as you prove the efficacy of your formulas for various different issues, those IPs apply to all of those, right?
That's correct. Yep.
So you're basically owning at least a piece of the means of production for others.
Agreed. Yes.
That's a big deal. It's I think something that my personal standpoint is that I think psychedelics are amazing, both for the recreational side and otherwise. But there's just this stigma attached to when you tell people, hey, I had this experience, or I've learned this thing about this company. There's just that big red aura of like flakiness attached to it that takes people completely out of the picture. But what you're actually dealing here with is, IP portfolio. You're dealing with a piece of everyone else's deal, effectively. If you can prove out what you're trialing here, then you own a piece of the industry, not just of your particular enterprise.
We believe very strongly that we can't boil the whole ocean on our own. And it makes much more sense to partner with other companies who may have more expertise in a particular indication than we do. We're here to primarily to develop and patent the technology necessary to make clinical grade natural psychedelic drug candidates, which up until now hadn't been done. And whether it's us developing those drugs or our partners developing those drugs, we just decide whatever makes the most sense.
Right. So I'm guessing that there's a lot more to come on the clinical trial front as you work your way through your existing trials.
Well, that's one of the great things about our model is it provides for a lot of news flow. It's not like we're a drug company with one molecule and we wait for studies to be done in series. We actually have several partnerships that all do drug development in parallel. And every time they have a milestone, we have a milestone. Oftentimes their milestone means they actually pay us a milestone in cash. So it's actually really good for us.
If it takes a while to progress things along legal ways to really open up the psychedelic industry, is your company well positioned regardless to be a strong revenue one?
Well, we're one of the few companies actually making revenue in psychedelics before legalization. This is one of the key aspects of our business model, is that our partners actually pay us cash for milestones that they achieve. So one option for us would be to, dispense with any of our internal drug development and the associated high costs, and simply just rely on partner drug developers. If we were to adopt a strategy like that, we could just sit and collect the milestone payments. For instance, these partners might pay us, X number of $100,000 every time they do a phase 2, X number of 100,000 every time they do a phase 3, pay us milestone payments when they get their drug approved, when they begin commercial sales, and then pay us royalties on the sales of their commercial products. So that in and of itself is a very attractive business model. And again, like you said, it's going to take time to develop these drugs. Better to have a business model that affords us the opportunity to generate revenue in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I note also that you have a Health Canada dealer's license. Explain to the Joe public, if you could, like the process that you have to go through to get Health Canada to give you that ability to move within the otherwise illegal landscape.
Yeah, the dealer's license is what's required to deal with controlled substances like psilocybin and MDMA, et cetera, et cetera. It takes all told about a year to get, at least. Many companies have been trying for much longer than that to get it. But it's really the foundation for everything if you want to be in this industry. So if you don't have a dealer's license or good access to a dealer's license, things are very tough. So it's very key. But in addition to having a dealer's license, we've also implemented GMP procedures in order to actually manufacture clinical grade candidates for human clinical trials. So our combination of dealer's license plus GMP, I think, puts us in a very, very good position compared to almost any other competitor.
And when the markets open up overseas, I guess that also puts you in the best of breed categories for what other governments are going to be looking for.
For sure. We're already working on clinical trials in the UK and Europe, and eventually also looking forward to working on applications in Australia and Korea and other jurisdictions. So you're right. Canada is well regarded in terms of its GMP and regulatory environment, and it's a great place from which to export these kinds of products.
A lot of retail investors generally are on the news lookout for big catalysts, something that one day makes your stock a 5x. Is there something that you think is coming down the pipe, whether it be 6 weeks or 6 years, where your company is going to basically announce itself with fireworks and say, I told you so, here we are now, we're as big as we promised?
I think the thing we're probably the most excited about in the medium term is our in-house clinical trial. As I mentioned, this is the first one to give natural psychedelic clinical trial candidates, as well as the first one to administer psilocin, the active form of psilocybin, directly to patients. This trial is scheduled to begin dosing in the next few weeks and will be concluded over the next year. And really the big aha, I told you so moment, I hopefully will come when we have data to show that psilocin is therapeutically more effective than psilocybin, right? So with that, we can point to data that shows that we may have the best psychedelic therapeutic candidate. And I think that will be something that we're very excited and looking forward to.
And so seasoned biotech investors know that when a company's going through trials, you never know when that news is going to pop in, right? You can't really time your run to buy the stock the week before it's going to happen. It drops one morning and it's either rejected or accepted. So anyone looking at your stock today and seeing admittedly that it's near a low for the year, now's a good time to probably jump in and be there when that news drops.
I like to say it's always a good time to invest in Filament Health, but today is an especially good time.
So, admittedly, everybody wants their stock to be higher and thinks that their stock should be. But if I'm looking at your market cap today, it's only $23 million for a handful of strong IP, clinical trials, and existing revenue. Like, I'll be honest, that seems like an actual bargain.
I agree with you. I think the psychedelics market has been probably like a certain amount fairly battered for the last year or something like that. But I think now it's been battered so destructively that I think now it's time to actually look for really good value plays. And I would think that investors returning to the psychedelics market would look at things just like you said, companies that are generating revenue, that have patents, that have human clinical trials up and running, not just announced, not just planned, but approved, running human clinical trials. Companies that have their own in-house manufacturing, companies that have managed the import and export of controlled substances all over the world, and companies that have management teams that are experienced in the thing that they are doing and that have previously been successful.
Do you sometimes look at the news that comes out from other companies in the space and just want to throw your phone against the wall?
Well, it's maybe a bit of Schadenfreude. I mean, like I said, a good example is other companies love to announce provisional patent applications, which let's just be clear, could and probably is just a napkin scribble. Provisional patent application costs $100 and needs like nothing more than a napkin scribble to come into an existence. So to think that that's a newsworthy event, really what that does is belie a lack of any actual news. At Filament, we announced issued patents like we did yesterday, and like we did in the summer with our first patent. So same thing with clinical trials. We announce approved clinical trials rather than intentions to file sometime in Q4 of next year, maybe Q1 the following year, right? We like to announce things as they actually happen, not vague plans.
Good enough. I think that every new hot sector that comes along, whether it be blockchain, crypto, AI, that goes hot for a minute and then sinks. I always think to myself, yeah, but AI and what, right? Blockchain and what? Psychedelics and what? It's not normally, the base sector that's interesting. It's what you do with it, right? If you're just in the cannabis space and you don't do anything interesting with it, who cares? If you're just in psychedelic, but if you're in the psychedelic space and the biotech space, you're almost, the psychedelics is irrelevant. It's just the means of getting to an end, which is the biotech side.
It's biotech. It's addressing mental health, improving mental health outcomes for millions of patients is what it is at the end of the day.
And if there's anything that we could certainly use as a species right now, it's better end outcomes for depression and psychiatric issues.
People's mental health hasn't been getting any better the last couple of years. That is for sure.
For sure. All right. Look, I usually end these things by asking one more prickly question, and that is, as a CEO of a public company, what other company in your space do you look at and say, okay, that's interesting. They're doing an interesting thing?
That's a good question. There is another naturally focused company called Psyence, Psyence. They're interesting because they are actually growing their own magic mushrooms in South Africa and working on pharmaceutical grade formulations derived from those mushrooms, and working on several very interesting clinical trials all over the world. So that's a company that I would give a shout out to for sure.
Nice one. Well, thank you again, Ben. This has been an interesting chat. I think there's probably a lot of people who've watched this and have a really good sense now of what Filament's really doing. And maybe we'll check in with you in a few months and see you on your progress.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man.